Hey everybody, my name is Jamal Malik, and in this video, I'd like to talk to you about business operating models. Now, this is most useful for sellers in the tech industry. However, frankly, if you're a seller in any industry, you can probably use this or find this useful as well. Okay, so there's 4 types of business operating models, and I'll get into why it's important for you as a seller to know what type of operating model your customers have after I explain each one. I'll talk about pros and cons and how you can use this to your advantage. Okay, so the 4 business operating models include coordinated, unified, replicated, and diversified. And an easy acronym that I use to remember that is simply CURD, C-U-R-D, coordinated, unified, replicated, and diversified. Now, the best way to think about these operating models is to think about them over 2 pivots, and that's standardized and then integrated. I'll try to, after this video is done, pull a box in the corner here, and so you can kind of follow along. But let's talk about the first operating model, which is coordinated. Okay, so if we go back to our 2 pivots and we look at the top left quadrant, you have coordinated, which means that the organization is very integrated, but it may not be very standardized. Okay, so the top left quadrant there. So what does that mean? That means that you have business units that may not work and operate the same way. However, they do integrate or coordinate with each other fairly significantly. I'll give some examples of some companies that look like that, and then again, why it's important to know that. Okay. The next one we'll talk about is unified, which means that it's highly standardized and then highly integrated. So it's in the top right quadrant. This means that all the business units are doing things the very same way, and they're highly integrated. So they're interacting with each other fairly considerably. Okay. The next one we'll talk about is replicated. So that means that on our pivot, it's low on integration, but high on standardization. Okay. And so, for example, you have business units that don't talk to one another, but they operate in fairly the same way. The last one we'll talk about is diversified. That means it's low integration and low standardization. Okay, so that means that you have business units that don't talk to one another, possibly, and probably don't work together or do things the same way as well. Okay, now let's talk about each one real quick, give some examples and some pros and cons of both. However, before I do, let me also just shed that there is no good or bad way of setting up a business or the way you operate it. Okay, it really just depends on your goals as a company and what you're trying to drive in terms of outcomes. Okay, so let's talk about coordinated. So let's use a very specific example of a company that's highly coordinated. Okay, and I'll use Microsoft. So on the scale, you have a lot of business units. Let's use the business groups or the product development teams that actually do want to, on the scale here, integrate with one another. However, they may not actually operate very similarly. Now, there is an argument that Microsoft is moving towards the top right quadrant, towards unified. However, for this instance, let's just kind of keep it kind of where they are today. And that is, you have lots of different products that obviously don't operate or do the same things, but you do want them to communicate to an extent. Now, what this does, it allows organizations or companies to produce products, and as they produce them, quickly build them, and then after the fact, look how they connect to one another. Another example of a very coordinated business could be IBM or General Electric, meaning that they have a lot of business units that are kind of doing their own thing, but to increase the value proposition that they brought out to customers, they do talk to one another. And when they bring solutions, it's an amalgamation or a combination of several products together. Okay. Now, the pro to this business model is that you can spin up business units fairly quickly. Okay. And then after the fact, figure out how they talk, integrate with one another. A con here, though, is that typically each business unit requires or builds again, for the sake of being quick, their own processes. They typically duplicate systems or infrastructure. It's kind of their own thing, right? And so in that respect, it can be very expensive for these types of organizations to start up new things, but it also allows them to kind of shut things down if things aren't working out without impacting the other business units. The next company or type of business operating model that we'll talk about is unified. Okay, an example of a company that fits within the unified operating model could be Apple. Okay, so Apple creates products that are highly integrated and they kind of work and operate very similarly as well. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of building products in this fashion or operating businesses in this fashion? Well, for starters, whenever you have a very coordinated operating model, every single time you add a new product into your ecosystem, you're essentially taking the value prop of that product and you're leveraging how it interacts with the other products and creating an environment, if you will, that feels very similar, that works very similarly. It also keeps costs down in terms of how you run and operate the business. The con, however, is that it typically prevents organizations from growing very quickly. So for example, in the case of Apple, they do make acquisitions from external vendors. However, it takes a very long time for them to fully integrate those different products as part of their overall value prop to its customers. Okay, so that's unified. Now let's talk about replication. Okay, so replication means that you're highly standardized, but you're not very integrated. An example of a company like this could be FedEx or restaurant chains like McDonald's as an example. Okay, so what this means is you have an operating business that is doing the same thing over and over and over again. However, they're not working with other business units. And that makes sense, right? Because if you have a FedEx in Massachusetts and you have another FedEx location in Sri Lanka as an example, they will not talk to each other. They serve different customers, but for the most part, they're going to operate very similarly. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have like local geographic nuances or things that make it unique to that location. However, for the most part, from a basic infrastructure perspective, they're doing the same thing, they have the same processes, and they operate very similarly. Okay? The last business operating model we'll talk about is diversified. Now, diversified, as you can imagine, basically means that, like we said, low integration, low standardization. A great example of a company like this is Berkshire Hathaway. They're a holding company. All they do is they purchase other companies, they fold them under the umbrella of the Berkshire Hathaway group, but they allow them to operate and, frankly, do their own thing without much involvement with the other operating groups or the business units that's under their purview. Okay. Now, as a seller, the reason why it's important for you to know what type of business operating model your customers have is because it gives you a strategy in either how to expand or figure out how to make initial contact with the customer. So for example, if you're trying to sell to a coordinated business business, that means that you typically will have to sell the solution individually to each business unit. Okay. Now you could, once you get into one, talk to another one. However, it's not as easy as you think because each of the business units might have their own processes, their own goals, their own investments in technology and infrastructure for that matter. Okay. If you're talking to selling into a unified operating model, then that actually might be a little bit easier. However, initially it could take a lot of work to sell yourself into that ecosystem. However, once you do, you know that it's easily replicatable to other business units, the solution that you're selling, because they have the same processes, they have the same standards, things look and feel kind of the same way. For replication, it can actually also be a little challenging because it's difficult to sell to each individual business unit, it takes a lot of time, as you can imagine. However, if you do, then you can then go off to another business unit and kind of have the same conversation, but there's no guarantee that it'll take. However, if you're able to sell into corporate a solution and you're able to roll it out to one business unit and you can prove the value back to corporate, then it typically means you can very easily turn around and roll out your solution to all the other business units in the environment. Within diversified, same deal. Pretty, not difficult, but once you get into one, you can use your relationships to then say, hey, we've helped this business unit and now we'd like to talk about how we can help you. However, it's not a done deal, right? Just because you're sold to one, it allows you maybe through an operating agreement or through an MSA to have a conversation with another through recommendations. However, you may have to build a solution every single time for each business unit that you're selling into. Okay, so this has been a really quick overview of business operating models. As a seller, why it's important to know what the operating models are for your customers and how you can leverage it to help expand or land your solutions within the environment. All right, happy hunting. Take care.